Hello, welcome to another ISA 4220 presentation. I'm Patrick White, and today we will be discussing IMAP and DNS. I will go into the technical side of things as well as discuss best practices. This is KSU, Fall Semester 2018. Alright, so IMAP. It is the Internet Access Message Protocol. Basically, this is a protocol that you can use for communication between an email server and a client within the network. It will retrieve mail from a server over a TCP/IP connection. IMAP utilizes dovecot to configure an IMAP server. Regular IMAP will use port 143 to communicate, and the secure version IMAPs will use port 993. And just a little bit about securing it. Obviously, we know at this point that the S at the end of those basically just means you're using the secure socket layer or transport layer to encrypt the data that is being communicated and stored. Basically to enable this, you just go into the configuration files after you obviously have dovecot installed. Go to this file that I have listed here and just change some settings such as enabling SSL. Let's see here. You can set SSL to a number of different versions. There's yes and disable plain text, or choose not to disable plain text. And the difference between that is with the SSL equals yes option, it is offered to the client, but the client isn't required to use it. And so when you disable the plain text, you allow the login with plain text authentication even when you're not using SSL on the connection. This is obviously very insecure because the plain text password is exposed. So let's say you have SSL equal to yes and disable plain text auth equal to yes. This basically means that the SSL/TLS is offered to the client, but he isn't required to use it. However, the client isn't allowed to use plain text authentication unless you've already chosen to use SSL or already have it enabled first. If non-plain text authentication mechanisms are enabled, they are still allowed even without SSL. And depending on how secure they are, the authentication is either fully secure or it could have some ways for it to be attacked. So an even more secure way than just saying SSL equal yes is to put SSL equal to required. So SSL or TLS is always required even if the non-plain text authentication mechanisms are used. So, any attempt to authenticate before the SSL is enabled will cause an authentication failure. So that's just getting IMAPs, getting the encrypted version for added security. So obviously getting IMAPs is one of the hardening recommendations and best practices that you can use when you're using the IMAP protocol. Some other things with IMAP, obviously you're communicating between a mail server and a client. So you have to understand how IMAP interacts with the mail server. IMAP and POP3, as we discussed last week, are similar as they're both used to receive or retrieve emails from a server. The main difference, there's a couple main differences between IMAP and POP3. One of them being that IMAP will keep the emails on the server even after they've been retrieved, but even though they're still kept on the server, they can still be managed. You can still choose to delete them, or one of the hardening recommendations would be to archive all the old emails, secure them somewhere else, and delete them from the server. This will clear up a lot of room, because if you just keep all your emails on the server, you're going to have a ton of emails to sort through, and it's just going to be too much. So by archiving it, you're able to separate them into sections, by date or type, and securing it that way. You want to do things like block lists to secure the mail delivery service. Obviously, emails can be spoofed, and insecure email addresses and messages can become a problem within the system. And IMAP will send these emails unless you have specified block lists that will flag certain email addresses that are known to send out spam or phishing attempts or whatever through email. Another best practice would be obviously configuring IMAP with Dovecot for added security features. And excuse me, there's a number of things you can do with Dovecot. Obviously, you want to configure the IMAP server so that only certain addresses are listened to. So by doing this, let's see here. Yeah, once you have the known IP addresses of the people within the network that you're going to be using, you can set it to where the server will only listen to those addresses. And with IMAP, that is a huge advantage over POP3, because IMAP uses multiple devices, and it will sync all of the messages and folders and formatting that you've done to your email across all your devices. Whereas the POP3 is basically, you're going to have the emails unique to each device that you downloaded them on and configured them and whatever. So IMAP gives enhanced flexibility in that sense. So the next topic is DNS, or domain name system. This is basically just a way for machines to convert a domain name to an IP address. Obviously, we see domain names, URLs, the names of things, but we don't know exact location of that device or the exact identification of that location. So DNS will translate it into IP addresses for the computers to basically understand. We are using IIS and bind in Microsoft and Linux, Ubuntu, respectively. And obviously, you can configure DNS with both of those applications, software, to set it up in whichever way you'd like. Obviously configuring it, you want to make sure you're listening to the correct port, and you also want to make sure that you are creating the correct zone entries and zone files. After that, you want to verify the zones and restart your server, and you should be good to go. So, best practices with DNS. So, with DNS, you want to only provide the servers and data that is necessary for the task at hand. So let's say you have a public DNS that you use, or that you let the public use to translate the names into the IP addresses. You want to make sure that you're only making available the servers that are responsible for the function, and only that data should be accessible to the general public. You want to make sure all your other DNS servers and DNS data should be restricted to the internal access only. Publicly accessible servers should be authoritative only and should not act recursively. Individuals outside the organization do not need to use the recursive name servers, and those individuals should be using the name servers provided for use by their ISPs. Another best practice that you want to utilize with a DNS server would be to ensure the server's availability. So having a high availability pair or cluster is very important with this type of server because these servers are basically integral to how computers recognize IP addresses and so on. So having the high availability cluster will basically ensure continuous availability for any DNS server resource, whether it has a primary or secondary name server, recursive or authoritative. In the case of a publicly accessible server, an organization should provide geographically diverse servers in their events. And they also want to protect against large-scale denial of service attacks that may affect a provider's ability to serve your DNS data. You can use unique autonomous system numbers to protect against these DOS attacks. Another best practice is you want to hide your primary servers. Obviously, these servers will host the master copy of any zones, and they should be hidden on the primary. That means they should only exist to serve the data to the secondary name servers throughout the organization, and that they are not listed as name servers for any zone. They are not accessible to any end user. Just make sure you have the primary servers hidden away so no one's accessible to them. You want to limit the data that exists on the secondary name servers. And other than that, that's pretty basic for DNS configuration and setup. A couple best practices, and let's see what else. Have some references here that I used, and I think that will do it for this week. I'm Patrick White. Thank you so much.